PanOS networking security prevention everywhere. Ryan joined Global Knowledge after 20 years of experience with field installation and maintenance in telecom industry, and has worked in a wide array of communication networking systems.
Everywhere we go today, security is everywhere. The security breaches we see on the news, the security concerns with your social media, it's every day a topic of interest. Our business information, and of course, our personal now more and more, our personal information constantly under siege. And certainly you'd have to be, you'd have to live under a rock somewhere not to know that already, that if the data is accessible and not protected, that's certainly a big part of a lot of industries and a lot of administrators out there. So in this presentation, we talk about an existing course we teach at Global Knowledge for a very high-level network security device that I'll refer to as the PanOS. The Palo Alto Networks operating system is what a lot of folks would call a firewall, a next-generation unified threat piece of equipment for network communication. So let's run through some interesting introductory topics, some terms, because this PanOS is one of the leading security devices, according to lots of research you'll see out in the public spectrum. But I certainly consider this to be a device at the top of the network security game. So in this short presentation, which, by the way, is part of one of our courses, and we can certainly talk about that, our course identification numbers, for those that might be interested, or your IT team that might be interested in training, certainly want to make sure you have the information. This introduction, we're going to talk about the PanOS security platform. We do call it a next generation, and that's really a reference to the under the hood processing the firewall goes through as packets enter and leave the network. We have a couple of terms we like to introduce. In the old days, there were segments of networks and systems that we considered automatically trustworthy. That's changing, and so we're adopting more of a zero trust, we call it, and I call it a always verify. So you'll see that, and then finally we'll introduce just a quick look at the family of products that cover the smallest of enterprises all the way up to, of course, world-leading corporate enterprises with large footprints. So we'll talk about our operating system and the platform we call a single pass architecture, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Some of you may have some historical references of UTM security, and we'll reference how this single pass improves on what we've seen in the past. So let's get started with, obviously, I like to describe this as there are several stages we call the life cycle of the cyber attack. Now, these often begin with something almost invisible to an untrained user, a reconnaissance of your network, how port scans and host sweeps. For those of you that may not be as in tune with some of those terms, imagine someone suspicious in your neighborhood. There possibly recon activities looking and casing the neighborhood. Similar activities take place on your network, and vulnerabilities or open ports are searched for. We also see other stages here that really the life cycle of the progression, and of course the ideal objective result for the, let's call them the attackers, is to be able to exfiltrate that information from your network, deny service to legitimate DOS type behavior. So the idea here is attacks come in many forms. They happen from outside the network. They happen inside the network. There's just a whole array of pinpoints that we can target or secure because they are targeting different areas, and these objectives, our feature set is built to meet more than one of these objectives. My simple example to my students is this. If you take your laptop home with you and your teenager does some homework over the weekend, there's a very good likelihood that a program will be installed unknowingly, so it's compromised. When that system comes back into the network, what security capabilities does the network security program or products and computing systems, what capabilities do we have now? Because we certainly didn't have any control when the laptop left the network. So when you look at this life cycle, tell yourself that they must have a lot of different features that can react in different ways to different stages of the life cycle. This is more of an under the hoods look, but I will tell you, our firewall, which this course trains on the operating system, this is only one. Think about your favorite sports team, and we all have them. Of course, here in Dallas, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. No team is successful with one strong component. Same thing here. We have, of course, the firewall itself, and we see that down here in the network security bubble or box, but there's endpoint protection components that are integratable, but they are separate components. There's cloud functionality. So when you look at this, if I were to talk about the firewall in its place, the firewall is just a piece, and it relies on cloud-based intelligence systems. Some of you folks may have heard of things like the MITRE Corporation that catalogs, categorizes, and identifies threats all over the world and vulnerabilities. So we tap into that intelligence. And if I had to say anything about this slide, I would say that the Palo Alto Networks engineers are constantly updating their software to interact with, let's just throw a term out there. We have an Amazon Web Services. It's a very big part where we allow some plug-in functionality for cloud-based computing. So when you look at this and you see, well, there's a middle ground really where we are opening up the component of the firewall to be able to integrate and rely on other systems of intelligence. So some of those come into play. Again, these may be terms that you say, I have no recollection of that term whatsoever. A lot of you probably have used or every day use a software as a service. I'll use a cloud-based tool that you use every day for your job, an SAP product or a database system that you access in the cloud. Well, we call that a software as a service. We have a special visibility there for what we see as those SaaS applications. We also have what I'll call VPN, client VPN technology. If you have a large sales staff that's mobile, you may say, well, Ryan, how can the firewall, if they go all over the world to make these calls on customers, how can the firewall protect them? Well, a couple of ways. Certainly, we can have those users connect securely back into the network using Global Protect. And then we can apply the protections to them just as if they were sitting in their cube there in the lovely office. So beyond the other integratable, these are other third party, if you will, intelligence systems, autofocus and mind meld. We tap into the intelligence of those systems, and it makes our operating system that much stronger. An interesting component is Panorama, another Palo Alto Networks product that is used. Let's say you have a client that has 500 firewalls. Managing those individually can be a really daunting task. Panorama lets you utilize a centralized configuration system and push those changes out instead of do a single firewall to 500 firewalls at one time. So this slide, again, I think speaks to the many players that we are involving in our network security. More and more people take their tablets and they're not sitting in a desk. Network security is definitely involving more systems these days. So let's take a look at how does our firewall do this? We have I'm very fond of this term. I don't know how many of you have worked in what we refer to as UTM. I'm going to get my drawing out a little bit here and at least just draw. The Unified Threat Management has been a part of network security for many years. and many years, the antivirus and the anti-spyware and the networking functionality, they were all in the network, but they were separate systems on the network. So the packet being processed literally had to ping pong between systems. Well, that created delay. And of course, if you deal in networking these days, 2 seconds is a long time to wait for anything to respond. So we've taken a new approach. We have built in those protections inside. They're all built into the PAN-OS. We call that our single pass parallel process. Now you may say, well, that's a big mouthful of letters. All it means is there's a lot of processing taking place on the one. Once the packet arrives, we buffer the packet one time. So it's a pretty effective way to apply all this security based on how it's configured. And all of that includes the networking pieces, the user themselves. Maybe a user group is allowed Facebook access while a whole other user group is denied. We recognize an application like Facebook. We can identify it. I call it a fingerprint. That fingerprint is different than YouTube, and we can analyze and we can decide which applications are authorized or not. Even allowed applications can sometimes contain a threat or malware. So we tie these in, and this is our single pass parallel process. The real idea of this, folks, is it's more efficient. We can maintain a higher throughput because we perform these processes in parallel. We don't have to go to a point where the packet is processed by multiple systems, which delays it. Now, when you see under the hood here, it's going to be this again is more important probably for the folks that come to the training. They've implemented. I have a lot of courses where I've got people from vendor X or vendor Y, and they're converting their entire enterprise firewall security systems over to Palo Alto Networks. So at that point, it becomes more important to say, okay, look, we've got an under the hood architecture that is focused and very specifically designed to provide these processes. Again, I won't bore you with the details. It may not be as interesting to you or might be to others, but I will tell you, the network processing, you can imagine, source and destination information, that's a very focused component of our operating system. Passing that up to the next, if you will, or the next phase of processing taking place is all about security and enforcement. Is this application allowed? Is this a match to our specified profile? And so again, all about security. And then our signature database is where we house things like credit card numbers. How many of you have systems in place where if you've got someone making a purchase online, a single credit card number is likely legitimate traffic? However, our filter that we can build into the PAN-OS, if you see an exorbitant or unauthorized amount of matches to credit card number patterns, well, we may react to that differently. So under the hood, we have a brain that's responsible for logging and making changes to the config. But the processes of actually pulling the packets off the wire, running them through our single pass parallel process, that's the data plane. That's the arms and legs that are doing all the heavy lifting. The idea I tell my students with this slide is, look, if you are a race car fan, have you ever seen those pit crews? Now, those folks are extraordinarily skilled, but they only focus on their task, and they only care about the success and smooth efficiency of the front tires or whatever the case may be. So a little silly analogy, but it makes sense when you think about this is an important capability, important component that makes our operating system function. Now, when we look at this is probably more interesting to folks that are kind of looking into network security for the first time, analyzing your own enterprise, thinking about where do we fit as a business. I've got clients that are small businesses and they work out of their home. And I've got other clients that have Palo Alto Networks, for example. Those folks, they have a multi-continent footprint. So let's take a look now. When you talk about certain terms, let's imagine our global knowledge headquarters there in Cary, North Carolina. That's what I would probably consider to be our headquarters here. And so whether it be a hospital or a school, you can see that the campus core, all of our resources, our SharePoint, our email, our server farms live in this data center. So when you talk about an open flow network, for a long, long time, we certainly considered the edge of our network to be that perimeter. That's where all of the threats are going to come from. These days, as we start to advance this, as I mentioned, I'll call out some things here. Let me get my tool handy. Out here, you've got people in your building that work exclusively with these cloud-based systems. Those are vulnerable. And if an attacker can see that information or access it, we certainly want to track, and we use a tool called Aperture to track those cloud-based applications. We've got a firewall placed here, but what about our branch offices? Everybody knows you need a strong firewall at the edge of your network, whether you're at home or whether you're in your corporate environment. But how about your branch office down in Houston? I've got a new salesperson down there, and that person has a 3 or 4 person office. Well, communication between that office and our core, again, vulnerable, could potentially be accessible, and that's a problem. So what we've looked at here is dropping one of our preferable, it might not be the largest device, but one of our appropriately sized firewalls at that office. And look what we have now is a secure communication, IPsec or SSL VPN, between the two locations. So we've, again, protected our internal resources from prying eyes. That brings me to these folks. Large numbers of workforce don't sit at a desk for more than a few minutes a day or maybe even a week. So we talk about these folks as mobile partners. And we use what we call Global Protect when we are incorporating. It's a client VPN, but it establishes a secure communication. And then again, this person can be in a completely different country, but they are held accountable to the rules and regulations, if you will, built in the perimeter firewall. A lot of people call, well, traffic that leaves your network or enters, we call that north-south traffic. And certainly there are some bad things in the internet. But you know what? We've started looking internally too. Do you have a system of servers that update each other, servers that communicate with each other? It may be in a VM server farm. Look how we've taken and even dropped a VM model fire. These models are here placed in a position so they can monitor and scrutinize and protect that east-west traffic. Doesn't ever leave our network. It certainly doesn't mean that it's should be without consideration. Let's see what else we have here, and I'm going to change back to my other mode. When I show this slide in class, I say, folks, depending on what the attack is, I mean, is it Tor websites? Is it streaming? You've got people that download movies, and they're eating up all the bandwidth. Is it people that are not regulated and they open emails? Whatever the threat is what I'll say. We have a feature matrix here. Every one of these is one of our specially built-in security protections. Okay, file blocking. I'm working with this in a group that is in class this week. If you have a proprietary or a watermarked document, classified or top secret, we can utilize file blocking. We can utilize that as well as control things like if people are visiting websites that are categorized as hacking. We can control those things. And the idea here is if you bring me, here's what's happening in our network, what do you have that can combat this? I would look to this, again, this matrix of features because they all have some impact on something. So I get real excited And certainly, I think that anyone that's interested in network security and maintaining, not just today, the big push in my eyes with Palo Alto Networks is that every year they come out with a major release, and it has increased security, increased functionality, increased integration. So what you see on the screen here is a series of hardware devices. Now, here in my home office lab, I have a little small 220. That would be good for a small a SOHO, small office, home office type environment. And all the way through these other devices, you gain in, of course, capacities, throughput capabilities, speeds and feeds, we call them. But over here, this is what I would call just the megalodon firewall. This thing is a multi-slot, multi-chassis, multi-component, if you will, gigantic, powerful PAN-OS device. So from big to small, we've got an offering for any environment. Below here, you see something. These are different than firewalls. This is a panorama server. And of course, you may think, well, we're a VMware shop. We use all virtual stuff with another operating hypervisor. We can handle that as well. All of these are available. We have VM firewalls. We have panorama VMs. So rest assured, if you're not in a physical environment, but more virtual machines, certainly we can accommodate that. There's one other thing I want to mention right here. When someone downloads a file, say that one of you folks sent me a Dropbox link today, and I click on it and you said, hey, this is a great little spreadsheet tool, and I downloaded it. Well, we have a tool called Wildfire. It's really a sandbox in the cloud. If I downloaded that file and the firewall said, hey, looks harmless, no problem. Our Wildfire component emails the firewall, submits that to the cloud and says, here, I picture it as a bunch of mad scientists in an evil laboratory. And I'm certain that's just my own analogy, but they analyze that file for behaviors that may be malicious. That's our 0-day type protection. It can come back with a verdict and say, Ryan, the file you downloaded, that's malware. And we could take action, sometimes within just a few minutes. So what you see down here, Panorama and Wildfire are alternative components, supportive components, I would say. Now, a lot of people, of course, deal in either VMware or whatever virtualization system you use. Again, I tell you that we can cover. We've got the appropriate files to deploy in your virtual environment, even from, this again would be a little lab device over here, the VM50 on the right, all the way up through some pretty significant throughput speeds and capabilities with the VM700. So if you look at this, it's really telling you, look, we've got if you've got certain features enabled, then here's our throughput numbers and our measures of what capabilities that specific device has. The good news of this is, Ryan, what if I have a VM50 in my environment to play with? The good news is the feature set you have access to there, would it be exactly consistent with even the larger hardware devices? So consistent operating system makes for a user-friendly experience and transition without a doubt. Now, what we like to talk about let's say that, I've got an administrator, he's in the class now and he's involved in a hospital environment. Well, think of, a main building, and then you've got a campus environment. You've got different colleges, so the different specialties. Well, we've got a feature called virtual systems where we take a physical firewall. Let's say it's a 5000 series. We actually create logical boundaries. We split that physical firewall and all its interfaces and processors and resources. We split them into two, what we call virtual systems. Now, let's say that one of you is the administrator for the main doctor college. Well, you could have administrative access to virtual system A. You could control the zones and rules and every security component configured, but you would have absolutely no access to the other Firewall, the other virtual system. And the same is true for vSysB. It's a legitimate split or a logical separation, and it can certainly create a nice administrative boundary that just takes a single box, and then of course we create multiple logical boxes and coordinate that. So it's a really neat, popular feature. So with that, there's a couple of terms. That's our introduction, and certainly from this we go on into talk about every single thing that you would ever want to know as an administrator of a PAN-OS device. How do I log in for the first time? What are the interface configuration options? So in our course, that is, we call it the Essentials course. We would now continue this and move through taking an actual device out of a box. We'll simulate, here's your firewall. Now that you've seen the basics, let's take it out of the box, let's power it up, and let's begin configuring. And so when you folks consider your interest in Palo Alto Networks and your network security stance, if you will, remember the Palo Alto Networks name. Their website is insanely popular. It's informative and certainly can give you some good things to think about if you're looking at your own enterprise or even your own home security. With everything going on today, the gaming and all of the different dynamic nature of our operating systems, our devices, and the threats we face, Palo Alto Networks and our PAN-OS is a real sharp sword, I'll call it, in our armory against network security breaches and attacks. So with that, you now have seen the operating system we call PAN-OS. We talk about a very efficient way of processing the packet once and then moving it along. That's our single pass parallel process. And zero trust just means, look, even though you're inside our network, we're still going to analyze the traffic and just make sure that everything meets our corporate security requirements. And I certainly appreciate all of your time to join us here for this. I know we'll have some interesting questions, and I'm excited about that. But moving forward, I would certainly encourage you to consider joining us, or at least looking into our offerings related to Palo Alto Networks, and specifically our Firewall Essentials, we call it, where we learn the basics you saw here today, and we continue to grow those things. And I would be just pleased as punch to see all of you there at some point. We offer virtual trainings, you may or may not know. We could meet together in a classroom. We could even be on your site. So I'm extremely excited, and I'm happy to answer any questions. At that, I guess I'll turn that back over to Miss Sarah.
Hi, so I don't have any questions in right now. We're going to give everyone a couple more minutes to enter those in. Again, that's the question box just on the side. Feel free to type anything in, and we'll get Ryan to answer those. And I also just wanted to note that the course that Ryan was mentioning earlier, I have posted a link to that in the chat box. So if you wanted to go and look at what the full course offering was, what other modules were, you can go through that link there.
Any questions at all, I'm happy to speak to it. Certainly share.
So while we're waiting for some of those to come in, is there a most common question you receive when you're teaching or going through this module? Like, what are people kind of most concerned about for this?
That's a good question. A lot of times folks do come from other firewall operating systems. So they focus on the single pass parallel process, which to me is the most important topic I wanted to share because administrators of other firewalls, we talk about converting the old way we refer to as a port-based approach and how IP addresses and destination protocol ports are used. Well, a lot of different applications, let's just use Facebook and YouTube, they both use a browser. They both use port 443 for the networking folks. So there's a lot of discussion, initially not as much, but certainly the conversion over to this, okay, how is all of this done, the single pass parallel process? How does all of this happen? Because a lot of the introductory drawings, these diagrams, it still looks as if there are different stops and ping pong hops. So when you get to the point where you're learning the details, they really are interested in the actual under the hood. And there are tools. We have a largely GUI or browser-based interaction with the firewall. But there is a CLI. And if I introduce that to people, I show them a feature that we talk about, okay, here in this CLI output, you can see I like to say the firewall, you can see it thinking. And so the biggest challenge I'll ever get a lot of times here, people are still waking up and their coffee's just settling in. So the early questions here are usually from very, very high level experienced network personnel. And they really want more information. Okay, how can this be happening at the same time this is happening? So, without, breaking open a firewall and the first thing in the morning, there's a lot of interest in that single pass parallel process because that is designed to more quickly and efficiently move traffic through while still applying virus protection and spyware protection, intrusions, and all of the other things we mentioned there. How can the operating system do that and still be efficient and effective? So sometimes I will break down a little more in depth to show the actual components, just doing their, I'll go back to my driving team, the pit crew. There's nothing to stop the right front tire from being changed while the left front tire is being changed. So initially in this section, it's really a lot about that and just kind of nailing down, is this just sales spiel? Is this magic that's put in at the factory, or how exactly is the operating system functioning? So that's a good question, and I think that's usually what we see at this early stage.
Okay, so I have a question here. Is Cisco certification a prerequisite for security?
Well, no. My answer would be no. It's certainly helpful, any certification that comes along with security. But I do have a lot of folks that come from Cisco backgrounds. So a lot of what they've learned, we build on, but we kind of change from a port-based approach. So no, you can certainly, as a matter of fact, that's a great question. There's a certification that is pretty popular right now. I'm going to get my pen back out, and it's called the PCNSE. It's the Palo Alto Networks Certified Network Security Engineer. Now, you don't walk in off the street and achieve that. We've got a base level. If you were a brand new administrator, what? PCSSA. We've got an entry level for someone that has been through the very basic class. Let's see, then we've got a PCNSA. So Palo Alto Networks has defined and designed a really natural progressing learning environment. And so by the time you have worked, you've come through the training, you've got some network background, and by the time you've ticked these boxes, you really find it's a lot easier to kind of go slow as you complete each step, because by the time you can challenge this exam, you've got a really broad understanding of what seems like hundreds and hundreds of features and topics. So no, Cisco is certainly not a prereq to come in and be involved in Palo Alto Network certification at all. Good question. If you have it, it's not bad.
And you kind of just answered this, but are there any other certification options for Palo Alto besides the three you just mentioned?
Absolutely. Let's see here. When we look at certification, so there's a couple of different things that I'll refer to. These are official. This is the top tier, I'll call it engineering level, but that's the top tier. These are stepping stones. Now, along with each course, again, Palo Alto Networks has developed these, they'll call them quizzes. Let's say you were with me in the class I'm teaching today, which is a follow-up to the essentials. Each class, separate from this big top-of-the-line PCNSE, has its own, the class we're referring to as the essentials, they call that the 210. There's a nice little assessment associated with that. The class I'm teaching today, they refer to as 214. We learn how to optimize the basic stuff you learned in the essentials class. It's got its own little quiz. These are just more assessments than certifications. And certainly there are certifications that are related specifically to things I don't work with as much. Traps as an endpoint protection. So as far as the certifications, you've got the left side here, which I would call the full spectrum of official industry recognized certifications. And then over here, you've got your little stepping stone class by class assessments that are available. Great question.
Okay. So sticking on certifications for the PCNSE, what are the prerequisites for that certification?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Everybody wants to know that, right? It's they suggest. Now, of course, there's reality, and then there's suggestions. So if you could walk in today into a testing center and pass that certification, they don't care. If you've got that level of experience, what the recommended approach is, of course, this 210 class, because if you come brand new to PAN-OS, there's lots of terms. It's terminology, it's proprietary features and functions. So this would be what I would consider the minimum. Come to a class, whether it's online or it is in a classroom, and then some hands-on experience. Now, in our classes, I'm not sharing that with you folks today, but it's very easy. You access a firewall. We give you a firewall we don't send it to your house, but you have an environment where you can log into a firewall and we can run these labs. We can work through these features. I tell people I can talk to the slides for days and days and days. I do like to hear myself talk. My wife will confirm that. However, the learning, I find you learn by doing. So the other minimum requirement I would suggest, besides the very basic essentials course, they say 6 months of hands-on experience. If you've got a Palo Alto Networks firewall and you get to touch it, you get to see it, you get to work with it, 6 months of hands-on is golden. But as far as we won't let you take the test until you've done this, this, or this, there is none. It's highly recommended that you go through at least some basic introduction just to get the terms. If you're a network security guru, you still need those Palo Alto Networks proprietary terminology. So that's another good question. 6 months and some hands-on. Go ahead.
All right. So for the firewall, are there different levels of support, or does general support come with the license of the firewall?
Great question. Great question. There are different levels. And so, yes, when you license, you can license a basic level of support, which is 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Larger customers are licensed with an additional capability that is going to be more thorough, 24/7, immediate replacement, opportunity, those types of things. So yes, you can purchase and license the different levels of support. There is a base level that comes with your standard threat prevention licensing, but absolutely, you can certainly have different tiers of support levels